Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Charles. Thanks for tuning in to the program today. You know, we've been talking about the Sermon on the Mount. That's when Jesus took his initial 6 disciples into a mountain to pray for them, and then to teach them, to encourage them in not only what he believed, but that he was totally all about. And he brought them into this position to teach them not only to mimic him, but to really be convinced that what he believed, what he felt, what he taught was the way that they needed to be and the way that it must be. And that is called the Sermon on the Mount with that. Now, we've been taking some portions of that and looking at it, and we want to continue with that today. And we want to turn over to the 6th chapter, okay? Verse number 25, it says this: "Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, nor yet for your body, what you shall put on. Is not the life more than the meat, and the body the raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, neither gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are you not much better than they? Which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon and all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these." Jesus was on the mountains called the Horns of Hattin. Just to the north, just to his left, he could point out the ruins of Sepphoris. Now, when Cyrenius laid siege to that Greek Jewish city, then he left nothing alive there. Killed 79,000, and then took 11,000 more as prisoners. And what he did, he had a certain level that he would take slaves alive, and anyone who was at that particular height, he would take them. If they were over that height, he'd kill them. If they were below that height, he would kill them. And so when it became symbolic throughout the East, they called it the Cyrenius cubit. And so people were saying that if they were over that height, then they were cursed. If they were below that height, they were cursed. And so one of the teachings that began with the religious leaders is that you cannot take 1 cubit from your height, nor can you add 1 cubit to your height. And so you must be content for that comes your way. But Jesus used the same example by telling them that their faith must be in God. They can't control the uncontrollable, but they can control their belief in God. They can control their confidence in God. Now, when Cyrenius killed the city of Sepphoris, he made it in such a way that he wanted that city to be dead forever and forever and forever. He tore down all the buildings. He plowed up the foundations of the buildings, and then he plowed up the entire region. And not only did he plow it up, but he had every one of his soldiers that laid siege to the city. He had them carry 4 stones, and they went into the plowed up area and they threw stones in the fields. which meant that the entire region was just covered with stones. And then after that, they sowed the whole area with salt to make sure that nothing would grow. And then they went out approximately 6 miles from the center of town and built a large ditch that went completely around the city. And this ditch was approximately 6 feet wide, and it was also about 7 feet deep. And it was and they filled the ditch with sulfur stones, and then set the sulfur on fire, which meant that coming up out of the ditch was not only the fire, but this poisonous sulfuric acid smoke that just poisoned and destroyed everything. Cyrenius says that there will be not a blade of grass, not a bird of flight, not a hare, not an animal, not an insect that would ever be able to live again in the town of Sepphoris. And that's exactly what it was meant to be, and was meant to be for all of eternity. But God had other ideas, because about 10 years, the destruction took place in 11 AD, and then approximately 21 or 22 AD, then some of the rocks, the sulfur, began to burn out. And so there was not a continuous ring of deadly yellow smoke that was coming up all the time. And there were holes or gaps in the smoke. And because those gaps that were in the smoke, then there actually were birds that had the ability to fly over that area now without dying and without killing themselves. Well, that lasted for another 10 years or so. And during that time, more of these sulfuric holes began to develop in the smoke, to the point that animals, foxes, deer, rabbits, they began to jump over the ditch and run through that desolated area and would go their way. And the Roman soldiers, they made a mistake when they devastated the area, because they threw the stones down first, and then they laid the salt down later. Now, a lot of that salt did get into the soil. It did penetrate the soil and cause the soil to be poisonous. But in other cases, it didn't. It stayed on top of the rocks. And so it didn't filter down into the soil. As such, then after a while, the grass that was immediately underneath the rock began to grow again. And it wasn't intended to, but it did begin to grow. And when it began to grow, it began to produce seed, grass seed, again. And when this began to happen, then the birds that would fly through, it would go through the holes in the sulfur cloud. They'd begin to go in, and they would drop down and get the seeds and fly back out. They'd come in and fly back out. And in addition to that, as the birds begin to come in, and then they in turn begin to even fertilize the area with the eaten seeds and so forth, then before too much longer, within about 3 years of that time, we had the very first flowers begin to spring up. And the flowers that began to spring up were called the lilies of the valley. And then later on the edges of the ditch itself, it was what was called the rose of Sharon. And so those began to sprout and began to grow in the very midst of desolation and devastation that was not intended to ever, ever, ever produce life. And Jesus, on the horns of Hattin, pointed down to the ruins, and he said, I want you to look at these guys. The Romans totally devastated. The enemy wiped this out, and the enemy intended for this to never, ever again see life or to produce life. But your Heavenly Father has control of things. You can't add 1 cubit to your stature. You can't take 1 cubit away, but your Heavenly Father knows who you are. He said, and now look at the fowls of the air. It was intended for them never to fly over this death. It was intended for them never to survive this whole atmosphere. But your Heavenly Father loves them, and He supplies for them. They don't harvest. They don't stock their stock into grain into barns. They don't reap. They don't sow. But your Heavenly Father takes care of them, even in the very midst of death and destruction. He said, look at the lilies of the field. They don't spin. They don't make clothing. They don't go buy material for their clothes. But even Solomon, as great as he was no match to the beauty of these flowers. You know, I remember a time I was hiking in the Alps in Austria, and I was up above the timberline, and I was walking on the Alps Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and I went kind of around this the trail, and then the trail went around a great big, huge boulder, and this rock boulder was probably in diameter, I'd say at least 8 or 10 feet in diameter. It was standing kind of an egg-shaped oblong style. It stood up about 20 feet, and it was solid rock, solid granite, and I was pretty impressed with the rock, and so I was kind of studying it and looking at it, kind of resting against it as before I continued on with my hike. And as I was standing there admiring this boulder, just above eye level, I saw something. And I looked at it, and I looked again, and coming out of that solid piece of granite, there was a purple flower and a plant. And I looked at that, and I said to myself, how did you get here? There's no soil. You would have had to start at the very bottom. And for how many years did you have to grow through this black caverns of the little places and cracks and crevices in this rock that you could grow out into the light 10 feet up? How did you do this? And I took my finger and I plucked off one of the leaves of the little flower and crushed it in my hand. I said, okay, so you're vulnerable. You're very weak. You're vulnerable. And then I took my steel-toed boots and I kicked that stone, and I hurt my toe really bad. And I said, okay, well, the stone's hard. It doesn't give way. So how did you do it? And I was wondering. I just stood there and wondered. I said, this is phenomenal. How did that flower grow through this solid rock until it reached the light of day. It couldn't happen except through God. And then the Lord spoke to my heart, and he says, it is because the flower trusted in me. I know how to direct it. I know how to guide it. It doesn't worry about how long it takes. It doesn't worry about the direction that he needs to go, because he has this confidence in me and me alone, and that I made it happen. And the Lord can do the same thing for us. Jesus said the same thing to his disciples. He said, consider the lilies of the field. They were not supposed to live. All intentions for their enemy was for it to die, to never, ever, ever be able to rise again. But God had other ideas. The vegetation has returned. The birds have returned. The animals have returned. The flowers have returned. It's because your Heavenly Father has watched over them. And as a result of that, then the Roman government was convinced that it was actually the desire for Earth itself to have Sepphoris to be rebuilt again. But Jesus used it as an example to his disciples. He says, your Heavenly Father knows who you are. He knows where you are. He knows what your needs are. He knows what you are allergic to. He knows what really gets you down. He knows what lifts your spirits. He knows everything about you. And as such, he should be in absolute control of your life. Even though your enemy has sought to destroy you, even though your enemy has rubbed his hands together and says, you are toast, you are a thing of the past, you will never rise again. Put your faith and your trust in Jesus, because it's through him that the impossible becomes possible and the dead comes alive. And so, as it was with this flower that I saw in the middle of this boulder in Austria, sometimes there is no explanation. There's only a trust that God knows what he's doing. He knows the direction that we need to go. And when we submit ourselves to him and we say, okay, Heavenly Father, I don't know which way to go. I don't know what to do. I don't know what is right. I don't know what is wrong. Help me. Direct me. And it may be that that direction has to go through many, many, many feet of solid granite rock. You can't see anything. You don't know where you're going. You're having to trust 100% in God's directive in order to get through this difficulty. And the difficulty you're facing could be anything. And the blackness that's all around you and the lack of direction that you can control is all around you. Maybe it's a result of a divorce. Maybe the loss of your job. Maybe a financial crisis that takes every penny that you have. Maybe a medical crisis that not only do you have the finances to deal with to pay the bills, but you have the horror of the medical failure in addition. Many, many things come up in our lives that can cause that blackness, that floundering around, not knowing what is right, what is wrong, and what direction to go. That's when God says, trust me. Trust me. Rely upon me and I will direct you. You don't have to know where you're going. You don't have to try to figure it out. You don't have to try to tell God the best way to go. He knows it already. In fact, He's the only one who does know it. How many years it took for that flower to start with ground level and begin to grow up through the cracks and the crevices and over the molecules and the grains of rock through that stone, through that granite rock, that granite boulder. We don't know how long it took. I don't know how long the boulder had been there. But eventually, when that flower relied completely and totally upon God, eventually it broke out of the blackness into the sunshine. And it began to beam and to grow to the point that when I came along, I saw it and was amazed and flabbergasted by what I saw. The Lord can do the same thing with you. What is your crisis today? What is the problem that you're trying to face? You can't add any height to your body. You can't take any away. But you can rely upon that God who feeds the sparrows, who feeds the birds, who feeds the flowers, to put the colors on those flowers, even in the midst of total and complete destruction. God gave life again, and He showed those disciples who were with Him. He said, guys, you are going to go through difficulties. You are going to go through situations where absolute, total, and complete guaranteed death is going to be your next step. But if you rely upon me, if you trust in me, then I will direct you through the blackness, through the darkness, through the hardness, through the impossibility, through the death, and I will break you free into the fresh air and into the sunlight, into a brand new life, if you trust in me. These disciples had to do it. Every one of them were tortured for the sake of Christ. Every one of them faced martyrdom except one. Every one of them faced persecution far beyond anything that we could ever imagine here in America. This persecution that is now many of our Muslim brothers and sisters, Muslim by birth, Christian by choice, are making every single day. They know that Jesus can direct them. They know that Jesus can cleanse them, can help them, and be with them. And so we too join with them in trusting our God.
Welcome to Canaan, a small indigenous community here on the west coast of Colombia. In recent years, Canaan has grown tremendously. The people here have a heart for God and for sharing His love. This is where the Cubit Foundation does their work. Over the years, Cubit has worked on developing the community in many ways, and by doing so, they've developed personal relationships and bonds that will last a lifetime.
extranjero, pues lo recibimos con mucho amor, recibimos con mucho aprecio, con mucho afecto, porque sabiendo que si esta persona vive tan lejos, no nos conoce y nos viene a visitar, eso para nosotros es muy satisfactorio y toca mi corazón de una manera especial.
Brad Charles is one of the leaders behind Cubit and their work in Canaan, Colombia. His passion is for helping people in need around the world and doing God's work out here on the mission field. The Cubit Foundation has done some incredible work here thus far, and God's presence is truly evident. Through partnerships with local Colombian churches, Cubit has taken part in service to the village of Canaan. And with your help, Cubit will continue to serve them and many more around the world.
When people give to Cubit, I want them to go. I want them to go with me. And I want them to experience this.
Lo imposible para el hombre es posible para Dios.
To find out more and to become a part of what Cubit is doing here in Colombia, log on to cubitfoundation.org. That's cubitfoundation.org.